Ken? Ken. Good morning and welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Ahale Svandiari and I run the Middle East program at the center. Before I forget, can I ask you please to close your cell phones, Blackberries, whatever, for the duration of the meeting? Thank you. Today's meeting in the mainstream religious extremism in the Middle East and North Africa is co-sponsored with the International Civil Society Action Network. Our panelists today will discuss the rise and prominence of religious extremism in the MENA region. Although most attention and policies focus on the problem of violent religious extremism, non-violent religious extremism continues to spread in communities throughout the region. Both forms are significant in their ability to alter the social, cultural, and political landscape of the Muslim majority countries. Speakers will examine these issues and discuss how the United States and international community can address the rise of religious extremism in the MENA region. For those of you who are here the first time, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars was established in 1968 and is located, as you know, in Washington, D.C. Congress established the center as the official national memorial to President Wilson. We always refer to President Wilson as the president who had a PhD. We can't say he was the, president of a university because Eisenhower was also president of the university. But we are a non-partisan center which aims to unite the world of ideas with the world of policy by supporting preeminent scholarship and linking that scholarship to issues of concerns to officials in Washington. The Middle East program began in 1998 in addition to spotlighting the day-to-day issues. It continues to concentrate on long-term regional developments and their impact on political and social structure, economic development, and relations with the United States. The programs pay special attention to the role of women, youth, civil society institutions, Islam, and democratic and autocratic tendencies. Our speakers today are Sanam Naraghi Anderlini, Ken Balin, and Mohammed Al-Sanusi. We have distributed copies of their full bios, so I'll just give a sentence about each of them. Sanam is an old friend. We have hosted a number of meetings together. She's the co-founder and executive director of International Civil Society Action Network, ICANN, and she's a senior fellow at MIT Center for International Studies. Ken Balin is the president and founder of Terror Free Tomorrow and author of Terrorists in Love. And what is very important for someone like myself is that he's a very good friend of Lee Hamilton, the former director and president of the Wilson Center, who serves on his board. Mohammed Al-Sanusi is the Director of External Relations, Secretariat of the Network of Religious and Traditional Peacemakers. He just told me that he was active, involved when I was in jail, and so I extend a special thank to him. Sanam, you can stay or you can come.
Do you mind if I stay? Is
Yeah,
that okay?
sure.
Thank you.
Please, by all means.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Thank you for coming so early in the morning on a Friday in the summer. Thank you, Hala, for hosting us, and to Ken and Mohammed for joining us. I came across Ken's book at the bookstore in on Dupont Circle, not Politics and Prose, the other one, and Kramer's, that's right. And I read it, I think, in 2 days, and I've been recommending it to everybody ever since, because I think it's such a phenomenal insight into the issues that we're looking at. So, as Hala said, ICANN is co-hosting, and we're a non-profit. We work with organizations across the world in conflict areas. We have a specific focus on the Middle East, looking and supporting civil society, particularly women's groups, in the promotion of peace, democracy, and rights. And one of the reasons why we picked up this particular issue was that in 2012, at our regional forum, where we bring women together from across 14 to 15 countries across the MENA-Asia region, it was, there was excitement about the Arab Spring and what was happening in Tunisia and Egypt and so forth, except that the women were already experiencing the spread of and the rise of the more extreme elements in their societies. And it was September 11th, we were talking as a group, and one of our Libyans said, the Salafis have come, and first they went after the dead, meaning they destroyed the shrines. And then they came after the vulnerable, meaning the women. And about half an hour later, we heard the news that the American ambassador and his colleagues had been killed. And it was devastating for our colleagues there, of course. And it was interesting that in the media, the piece that got picked up was the American ambassador's, the attacks on the American ambassador. The run-up to this event, all the early warning indicators, if you want, of really what's been going on had been completely missed and was never really reported on. So we started looking at this issue because we kept hearing it from women across the region, and I wanted to share with you some of the sort of overall findings, and then maybe we open up for discussion later. So the first thing is our question. The questions that we've been asking have been the spread of Salafi, Wahhabi versions of Islam, and we make a distinction between that and just saying Sunni, because I think that distinction really does need to be made. We said, where is it coming from? And the answers that we were getting from a lot of sources were, it's Saudis, it's the Qataris, and so forth. But when we actually started also looking at the context in which we were working, a much more complex picture came up. A picture of, we can go back 100 years in terms of the history, but if you look just even in the last 30 years, what you see is, for example, the migration of middle class and working class people to the Gulf from other countries. So Egyptian doctors and lawyers and engineers and so forth, going to Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, coming back, those influences coming back into Egypt. In places like Pakistan and I think, frankly, everywhere else, the spread of mosques and with a particular Wahhabi message. The madrasas that we've seen in Pakistan that are now for women and men, and the messaging that comes through. So, and it extends to Malaysia and Indonesia, and now we're seeing it of course, in West Africa and further down in East Africa. So there is this, it's almost like a long-term project of spreading a particular version and vision of religion, but it's more than just an ideology. There's a sort of, it comes with it a parceling of the kind of society we want, tapping into the frustrations on the ground amongst people. We were interested in why do young people, specifically young men, join these groups? How is it that they get, that they're either vulnerable, is it coercion, is it voluntary, how is it? And it's an interesting mix of tapping into their sort of thwarted expectations, if you want, of the lives that they expected to have and the sense of dignity that they felt entitled to, the way that they were brought up in terms of how they're meant to relate to women and how women are meant to relate to them, and all of these things falling apart in the context that they are living in. So instead they're seeing corruption and lack of employment and an inability to move their lives forward. These things get drawn on by the groups that are out there recruiting these folks. The other issue, and we can talk about a lot of this more, and I think Ken it really has been looking into the dimensions of how they tap into the young men and recruit them. The other question that we had was the issue of women. Are women, why are women being directly targeted? Is it a part, and is it a very sort of concerted issue, or is it almost collateral damage because you're dealing with patriarchal societies, and therefore it so happens that as you bring these versions of Islam or values, women are the primary sort of targets, if you want. And of course, what we found was that it's not collateral. It's not kind of an indirect consequence. And for me, it was interesting to make the distinction between other places where I've worked, where, for example, you've had sexual violence against women, say in Bosnia or in Congo or in many other conflict and crisis areas. And when you look at the sort of motivations behind it, it might be that it's a way of trying to affect the ethnic identity of a community. It's trying to destroy the ethnicity, and you go through women's bodies. You force pregnancy to try and destroy that kind of identity. Or you're trying to force displacement in certain areas, and you scare people away with the idea of rape and so forth. In our context, the targeting of women, and I don't just mean the physical targeting, I mean politically, legally, in the public space, what their role should be in society, is part and parcel of the ideology. So what they are doing with women is an important message that we need to bear in mind. And one of the places where this was really evident was in the case of Libya, where first we have women at the forefront of the revolution, really very widely. I mean, they started the protests. They were very much supportive of the messaging that came out in terms of getting assistance for the demise of Gaddafi. And they also tried very hard to have their voices heard in the international spheres when the Libyan National Council was formed, and there weren't any women there, and there were women's activists, very, very prominent people say, we need to be part of this process. And the international community was basically ignoring them. And sort of saying, in this region, it's a conservative area, women really don't have a role. Or, as women were complaining about the sort of constitution drafting and again, this influx of a very Sharia-oriented process. From the international side, we were saying, well, this is their culture, this is the way things are. And yet, if you look at the speech, the first speech that the Libyan transitional authorities gave after 48 years of dictatorship, one of the key elements in that first speech was that the ban on polygamy will be lifted. Now, those of us who are in Washington know that talking points are really important, and how speeches are constructed, and what gets included in a speech is an indication of how important of a priority it is. So this to us was, and to the women that we were working with, was an indication of the kind of society that these people were going to be promulgating. And certainly over the last 2 years, we've seen it over and over again in these various areas. So these are some of the sort of gender dimensions. And as for us, that as we work with advocates in the region and activists, the frustration has been that from a Western audience, or from a Western policy audience, they're still not getting the kind of resonance and response that they want. People here still don't take it seriously. And yet, we're seeing over there that it's not only this question of, how they want to position, how these extremists are thinking about where women should be in society, but they're also using women to promulgate their own messages. So they understand the power and influence that women have in societies, and they're tapping into that. And yet we on this side, who say on the one hand that we believe in women's rights and so forth, are actually not listening to the women who are on the front lines fighting this fight and giving us the analysis and giving us the information and insight really very, very early on. So those were some dimensions. The other issue that we're seeing is that, as I said earlier, they tap into people's frustrations on the ground, and they're selling a coherent vision and a version of a society that's going to come into existence. And it has to do with dignity. It has to do with people, as I said, young men feeling that they are part of something bigger, part of a bigger cause that's out there. And these are some of the, and in a sense, they're also, I mean, as we know, they're using social media and Western or technology that comes from the West to promote their message. So the medium is no longer the same as the medium is actually being exploited by the messenger in very, very clever ways. And yet, in terms of our responses, we're just not there at all. We really aren't able to kind of counter this or tackle this in any effective way. Even the way that it's framed here in the U.S. and so forth, it's the element is countering violent extremism, for example. And for us, it's really important to look at it before it becomes violent, or the elements that create the space for which this violence can be addressed. So we need to look at the lead up to the issues, and I'll end with this: that it's not just about countering what they've created. It's actually looking and saying, what are the alternative versions and visions that we are offering, we as a collective, whether it's us in partnership with the organizations and the governments on the ground. But if that's a vision that they're going after, and it's a long-term project that has the seeds have been sown, what is it that we're offering? And at the moment, unfortunately, if we look at the policy and the sort of practice that we have, it's very ad hoc. It's very militarized. We have drones, and you know, the discourse is, do we attack or not attack, or what's the level of violence that we use? It's very much whack-a-mole. It's like all of a sudden ISIL. Yesterday it was, you know, Al-Nusra. Now it's ISIS. But actually this is a much broader. We have to look at the connections between these various groups. And we also now have smaller sort of initiatives and projects that are going on, which are very effective. But it's almost like putting sort of bumpers on the outside of the Titanic. They're great, but it's not really going to solve the problem. We need to take a much more systematic approach and look at military and defense policy as well as diplomatic and other policies. We can't just carry on business as usual and then have little sort of initiatives here, you know, women's empowerment initiative there or a youth initiative over there to try and counter this massive, very long-term, very kind of strategic and ongoing effort that's really spreading very virulently across many parts of the world now. And I think we just have to recognize the complexity of the problem as a first step before we begin to think about how we tackle it. So I've thrown a lot of things out there and hope that it's a good start for a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanam, very much. You can go to the podium. You can sit. Whatever.
That's fine. Thank you, Hala, very much, and Mohammed, thank you, and Sanam, thank you very much. I'll just tell you that was Sanam's comments, while brief, were one of the most insightful overviews of the problem that I've ever heard. So it was really, I really commend those kind. I agree with everything she said, and it had a tremendous amount of insight from working on the ground and understanding what's going on. So I think if we just ended now, this audience would walk away quite enlightened. So anyway, let me take a totally different tact and go from the overview that Sanam so eloquently and insightfully outlined to the smallest level possible, one person. I was conducting research throughout the Middle East and in South Asia and East Asia. And as a part of that research, I was meeting with radicals on the ground, Al-Qaeda and Taliban members. And I interviewed at length over 100, met with several hundred more. Some, of course, wouldn't talk to me or just gave speeches. But at the end of this process, or during it, I came across 6 individuals whose stories were so compelling, changed everything I thought I knew as a so-called expert. That's the thing with her comments. I know she's been on the ground, because so many people talk about this issue who have never talked to a radical, who have never been on the ground. So it changed everything I thought I knew as a so-called expert, that I had to tell the stories of the people themselves, the Al-Qaeda people, the Taliban leaders, and the Taliban fighters themselves. And I ended up writing a book, and you're all welcome. I have cards that, and Sanam nicely mentioned the book that she did in 2 days, which was quite an accomplishment. I'm not sure I could read it in 2 days. Those stories are collected. So I'm just going to give you 2 very brief anecdotes from the book of interactions I had, and this is 2 Taliban guys. One fellow I spent the whole day interviewing, and this guy was no shrinking violet. He was part of the cell that was later responsible for the bombing of the Marriott Hotel in Islamabad, which was one of the worst terrorist attacks in Pakistan. So this is, and he was a very dedicated radical. He had, when he met me, began to have some questions about the cause, which if you read the book, you'll see. But he was a quite dedicated radical and a very devout Muslim. He knew the Quran by heart, and he studied extensively Islamic text. Anyway, we had a long day of interviews, and at the end of the day, we decided to take dinner together. So we went down into the lobby of the hotel where we were at, and the Pakistani restaurant was full. They wouldn't take us, so we went next door to the Lebanese restaurant. We sat down at the Lebanese restaurant, and the first thing he did, we had to get not only the waiter, not only the chef to come out from the kitchen, but the maitre d' to assure him that the food was halal. Anyway, he had never had Lebanese food before. So he left it to me to order all the wonderful, delicious dinners and treats you get at a Lebanese restaurant. And so as the food began to come, the hummus and the baba ganoush and the vine leaves and all these lovely things, I suddenly remembered a dream I had had that early morning before I had met him. And you have to remember, I was immersed in this world of radicalism and radicals, and I'm meeting with them, you know, and this is a very intense period of interviewing in Pakistan, one after another after another. So I start, you know, I start talking to him about, well, I had a dream this morning, and he kind of became quiet. And I did this all quite naively, frankly. I found out later on. I didn't know what I was stepping into, which is actually a lesson for all of you. Just be careful what you say. I mean, so I didn't know what I was stepping into, but I innocently started, and I was off the interviewing. We were eating dinner. So I started telling him about the dream, and I said, I was at the Jerusalem restaurant in Falls Church, Virginia. I don't know, it's a wonderful Lebanese food there. And I was, and they kept switching between here, the Jerusalem, and this Al-Maghreb where we were eating in Islamabad. And in the middle of all this delicious food, and it was the best hummus I had ever had in my whole life in the dream, I saw a figure of some kind of a man on a horse dressed in white robes. And I kept switching back, and I kept babbling on. And he became very quiet at that moment. And he said, very quiet, and he began to talk in a whisper, and I could barely hear what he was saying. And because when you say something, as you're devout and you follow the Quran, you talk in a low voice. So he said, you, a Jew, an American, had the dream I've been waiting my whole life to have. I had no idea what he was talking about. You saw a vision of the Prophet Muhammad. And then I just sat there. And then he asked me, did you see his face? And I had no idea what he was talking about. No, well, that's the whole dream I told you. You know, I saw the man on the horse. It was blurred like a dream. You sure you didn't see his face? No, I didn't. Allahu Akbar! Stands up and screams at the top of his lungs. Everybody in the restaurant turns around, stares at him. He's already something of a sight. He's dressed in the full jihadi regalia with the turban and robes and all that kind of stuff. And he said, if you had seen his face, I would have known that you, as a Jew, a non-believer, was having a dream from the devil. But since you did not see his face, this is a true dream, because the devil can never take the form of the Prophet Muhammad in a true dream. And since you are a Jew, and I believe a believer to be, you had this vision of the Prophet Muhammad. He proceeded at that point to quote to me verbatim from Quran every verse, this went on for a while, that called for love and understanding between the faiths. And this continued for quite some time, and we went back to the room, and you can read about it in the book. But it was an unbelievably moving event for me that I told him all of this, and that he could see me. You know, he had never met a Jew before. He had never met an American before. And the fact that he could see me as a human being someone capable of having this kind of a dream was mind-blowing to him, and it was equally mind-blowing to me. So he actually took an interesting course. After that, he left the radical cell that he was in. He's quite a fundamentalist, literalist Muslim today. He didn't change any of his beliefs, but he renounced violence. He renounced violence, which is the most important. So he was still an extremist, but a nonviolent one, which I think is far preferable. Another fellow I met with was also a member of the Taliban, and he was also becoming disillusioned with the Taliban, and a kind of a hidden story of what the Taliban are like, and I think it's all true for all radicals, is the amount of corruption and duplicity and hypocrisy within the movement is something we don't see in the West, particularly among the leaders. They tend to be like politicians anywhere, frankly, and so some of them are quite corrupt. And this fellow, because he was very devout, he was becoming disillusioned with the corruption of the Taliban. And he did something equally extraordinary at the end of our interview. He reached over and took my right hand and held it. This was quite a phenomenal act from a guy who was raised in the Afghan refugee camps inside Pakistan, fought throughout for the Taliban before 9/11 and continued to fight for the Taliban afterwards as a soldier inside Afghanistan. He took my hand and held on to my hand as a sign of friendship, which is Pashtun men hold hands as a sign of friendship. But I'm not Pashtun, I'm an American, and I'm a Jew, and he took my hand. Now, Mullah Omar would not even look into the eyes of an infidel. When the Chinese delegate, when he was head of state of Afghanistan, and a Chinese delegation came to talk to him, he wouldn't look them in the eye, he wouldn't shake their hand. They gave him a gift, customary meetings like that of Buddhas, which he had promptly destroyed as soon as the Chinese left. So this fellow now takes my hand and holds on to it. And I think, here we go again. This is like another breakthrough moment of communicating, another person who had never met an American, never met a Jew, communicating across this vast gulf that we have. And he again lowers his voice, so I know what's coming. And he says to me, the Prophet Muhammad said that the day of judgment will not come until all the Jews are killed. And if the Jew is hiding behind a stone, the stone itself will cry out, kill the Jew that is hiding behind me, to the true believers. If the Jew is hiding behind a tree, the tree will cry out, kill the Jew that is hiding behind me. Only the Garkar tree will not cry out, because it is the tree of the Jews. I pity those poor Garkar trees in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Anyway, most of them are cut down, if they still exist. But at that point in the interview, and we proceeded to go on, at that point in the interview, he's holding my hand, and I only had one thought in my head, to get the hell out of there. So not everyone's going to be changed through dialogue. And he actually went on, this fellow, if you read the book, to become more radicalized because the Taliban weren't pure enough and was part of an even more extreme splinter group. However, I'll close by saying something interesting, even for him, because I've always interpreted that as a kind of hostile environment. And I did a radio show one time, and somebody called in after I told that story and said, Mr. Bowling, you have it all wrong. And I said, well, it wouldn't be the first time. But this fellow, he wasn't threatening you. That was an act of friendship. He was holding your hand in an act of friendship. And he was warning you that if you convert, you'll be saved too. So it actually was an act of friendship. So maybe I was wrong. Maybe it was an act of friendship. Anyway, I will conclude with that note and happily listen to Mohammed's comments.
Thank you, Mohammed.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Helen, for your kind introduction, and thank you, Ican, for collaborating with the Wilson Center, and thank you for coming so early for this discussion here. I want to focus my discussion on the network that I'm leading, and it's a network for religious and traditional peacemakers, and It's an initiative that started by the Finchurch Aid and with the United Nations and other international institutions, and the purpose is really to empower religious leaders to address issues, of radicalization as well as to increase the capacity of religious leaders around the world. I want to also emphasize that how important it is to have religious leaders and traditional peacemakers working on the ground, addressing everyday issues of violent extremism and radicalization. This work needs to be recognized because I believe they are in the front line trying to address these issues day in and day out, but they are not really recognized for their work. So we're trying to work with them on the ground in different countries and give them the capacity they need so that they can address these issues. One of the things that I wanna focus on is that there is a missing link between the work that the religious leaders and traditional leaders are doing on the ground and what governments are doing. And there is a little collaboration, realizing that religious leaders, they have a better credibility than government. Just one example for that, recently there was a fund established last year by 19 nations, including the United States and Turkey, that are chairing the fund called Global Fund for Community Engagement and Resilience. And this fund aimed to raise about $200 million to increase capacity of to address issues of radicalization. So our comment was really, if you really want this to be more effective, you need to give the leadership to religious leaders, those who are more credible on the ground. We're just conducted a study and a survey in Somalia, in Al-Shabaab, and it will be released in a couple of months. But the initial finding that we found is that 82% from former Al-Shabaab fighters, they believe that they more trusted religious and traditional leaders when they discuss issues of radicalization. They don't trust government at all. So this is just another example of how the engagement of religious leaders is very important. We're also trying to bring religious leaders and find a forum for them to engage with policymakers. We're actually hosting in September an event here in the Washington area, bringing religious leaders from 6 nations, Yemen, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Burma, as well as Somalia, to Washington, and to have them share their experiences addressing issues of violent extremism, as well as engaging policymakers in discussion on these issues. So this is our way of lift up their work. Another area also which is very critical for our network is that to empower women in also fighting radicalization. Women are in the front line, and this is something that unfortunately is not recognized. I will just give you a little story. It happened here in the United States, in just our neighborhood. I live in Alexandria, Virginia. So we have a mosque, it's a huge mosque in the Virginia area, and there is a Muslim family living near the mosque, and they have a teenager, very talented. He goes to gifted schools and all of that. And his family, they're very happy with him. All of the sudden, his behaviors in the house are changing. So he started to tell his parents that he want to go to bed early, 5 o'clock, after having early dinner and go to bed so that he can wake up midnight so that he can study and all of that. This situation continues, and the family, they are happy that their son is studying midnight, and he's trying to do better in the school and all of that. But slowly and gradually his behavior starts changing. He becomes more isolated from the family, not interacting with his siblings and with his cousins and all of that. And all of a sudden, he basically stopped going to school. And basically his mother get worried about this situation and trying to understand what is going on. So then she realized that he is communicating when he wake up at midnight. He communicating with people in Europe and in the Middle East through social media and through the internet. And basically she tried to understand the situations, and all of a sudden he basically packed up and he said that he want to go to Syria to do jihad. So now she became very worried, and she went to the imam of the closest mosque and basically explained the situation to the imam, telling him all the story and all of that. So the imam basically told her that if there is any possibility I can meet with him. So finally he met with him and discussed with him, and he understand, and the imam was able to build relationship between this kid and him, and continue the discussion to the extent that the kid revealed to the imam that he has been communicating with some extremists in Europe and in the Middle East, and he is basically going to join them in Syria as well. And they gave him all the promises, to the extent that he was giving all the text messages and emails and to the imam, and the imam read everything, and people telling him that you shouldn't listen to this imam, you should really don't listen to him, this is not credible point of view and all of that. So the story here is that the imam is able to convince him, he's able to basically bring him back to his family and to the community. But the bottom line here, the person that actually deducted this whole kind of situation is the mother. So the mother is the one that actually was able to notice this behavior change in her son, and then approach religious leaders to address the issue. So this link here is missing. For us to fight radicalization and violent extremism, we need to bring these links together. I just came back from Abu Dhabi 3 weeks ago. We hosted 20 top religious leaders from Nigeria in Abu Dhabi with the very prominent Muslim scholar in the Muslim world. His name is Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya. In fact, he was in this building just less than a couple of months ago. So he brought these religious leaders and to discuss with them issues of how to do peace building in Nigeria. And the 20 top scholars, they claim that they represent about 90% of the Nigerian Muslim community, but not a single woman with them from Nigeria. So I told them that you can't claim to represent 90% and you don't have any a single woman with you here. So we're trying to bring that kind of access to women who are working on these issues, as well as scholars who are dealing with these issues and every day. So there is a little collaboration there, and we're trying to enhance that. What we call it, actually, we need to create a track 1.5. Track 1 being that the government diplomacy and all of that, but track 2 is the civil society and religious leadership. So we need to come in the middle somewhere so that we can have that collaboration to address these issues. We also realize that issue of education is very critical. Most of the former Shabab fighters that we just interviewed, we found that they have a huge lack of education. So lack of education, lack of sense of purpose. So these guys who are joining extremism, they have lack of sense of purpose, so that they wanted something that to engage them because of the economic situation and all of that. So this is what's happening in the Muslim world. But I think with the efforts of religious leaders that need to be recognized, I think that will help to improve the picture. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Before I open the floor to your questions, I would like to put a question to the panelists and then see whether they would like to comment on what they said. Muhammad, not every religious leader has a sort of positive effect on the community. I mean, on the contrary, we have had religious leaders who have been part of instigating and even recruiting young people in the name of religion. Now we are talking about Islam, in the name of Islam, to move towards extremism. So just sort of talk generally, saying that we need the cooperation of religious leaders. I find it a bit difficult to understand.
Yeah. So it's a very good question. I mean, it is true. Not all religious leaders actually they have the balanced understanding of Islam, and some of them actually they use religion to recruit people to engage in violent extremism and radicalization and everything else. But we need to realize that they are balanced and moderate religious leaders, that their role is not recognized, and also there is a little engagement between these balanced and moderate religious leaders and those who are having extremist views. And if we leave them in isolation, we cannot resolve the problem. Our meeting in Abu Dhabi with the Nigerian, they said this is the first time actually to engage with such a scholar from the Muslim world, and 6 of them belong to an organization, they call it Izala. Izala they call it, actually the long name, call it Izalat al-Bid'ah wa Iqamat al-Sunnah. This is an Arabic. So it's the removal of the bid'ah and the establishment of the Sunnah. So that's the name. You can see from the name, you can see their views. So this is the first time for them actually to interact with such scholars. Another point I want to make is that not all religious leaders actually they have credibility on the ground or with those guys who are engaging. I mean, we're working on the Syria issue as well, trying to find people who actually have credibility with the people who are fighting in Syria right now, and you can find only few.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
I would concur with that. I mean, unfortunately, there are a lot of religious leaders who are part of the problem and not part of the solution. And people follow. It's a difficult problem because you have to grapple with what the faith really means. And and a lot of them, unfortunately, are but to find the ones that can be part of the solution is obviously quite important.
Right.
I would, what we find sometimes very often is that when we speak about...
I'm sorry, I was told that unless we speak in the microphone, the overflow is not able to hear us, and we have people in the overflow.
So very often when we talk about working with women on the ground, we always hear the view, oh, well, a lot of the women aren't like this, or they point to the 2 or 3, or, the minority of women who become violent themselves or radicalized. And it's the same thing. We don't deny that these people exist, that there's a spectrum, that not all women are the same. But the question is, what's the theory of change that we're working towards? And if we don't identify and shore up the existing moderate voices that are connected into their own communities, whether they're religious leaders or teachers or women or whoever they may be, that's the first barrier that's going to get destroyed. And if they're gone, then who are we meant to work with? And this is something we need to recognize, that right now, the most decent, moderate people are the ones who are directly under attack in the region. So if you think of Salwa Borregas in Libya, who was assassinated, other Libyan women's rights activists are all having to flee. In Egypt, they're being attacked on both sides. We've worked with people. We have a colleague of ours, Yara Salam, who's now in jail, and she's this young, phenomenal. I mean, she is the future that you would want, that Egyptians should want, and yet she's sitting in jail. So the moderate voices on the ground are being targeted very deeply, and yet, again, when we sit back in the West, and the policy-making kind of framework, it seems to be like a football. You know, it's we're either supporting this team or that team, and that middle ground is being completely ignored, and it's either going to get destroyed or it's going to be radicalized in one way because somebody's going to come and provide protection or you know, the kinds of economic support that they need. So we need to put a much more nuanced lens in our own work.
Sanam, my sense, just like you, I work also with women in the region, is that there comes a time when the women in the region prefer to make their decision themselves on the ground, and rather than for us in the West to give them a prescription and say, do this and do that, and we will support if you do that, we won't support if you do this. So there must be a fine line. You know, I'm sure that, again, if we will circulate the discussion, this meeting, and my sense is that I will get a number of emails from my women colleague in the region saying that, once again, you sit up there and you decide what we should do, what you should do for us. So where is the fine line? And this is a question to the panel, really, where is the fine line that, you know, you have to respect and let our colleagues in the region decide what they want to do, but nevertheless support them.
Our approach at ICANN is very much that we see ourselves as a bridge, and a bridge has a metaphor of connecting, but also being walked over, if you want. But which is that we happen to have the international connections and sit in Washington and have the privilege of knowing what the policy discourses are in all sorts of places, whether it's in Norway or US or whatever. We have access to that information. So I think that it's our responsibility to convey that to our colleagues on the ground who are working in their own context and may not have the time or the energy to try and parse through what's happening internationally. At the same time, the other side of the bridge, which is really important, is that we keep saying, listen to what they say. Bring them in, and that's why our briefs are called What the Women Say, because as far as we're concerned, you're right, they know what they need, they know what the solutions can be. They very often, I mean, what we're finding is that they need our assistance in helping to convene them so that at least regionally they can hear from each other, or internationally they can strategize between what Syrian women are facing and, let's say, what Colombian women are facing. But the fundamental issue is they need to be engaged, not accommodated. And we're still finding that it's still the odd women's project or let's consult, we'll have a little meeting with the women and that's it. No, I think they have to be front and center of the discourse, and we want them in the mainstream media here commenting. How many Syrian women have you seen on TV talking about what they want? You know, we just don't have, we have them, we know where they are, but getting them into the mainstream is extremely difficult. So this is the challenge that we have.
Okay.
Well, I would just simply, I think Hala, you're right, and Sanam, you're right. Since 9/11, United States policy has been basically one of a military response. So I think as we bomb and drop drones and shoot and talk about arming people, and that's the only response we have, we're not going to win many friends or communicate with very many people on the ground in any part of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And part of our work in the network is really to find those who are working on the ground. They have their own initiatives on the ground and support them. A person like Masarrat Qadim, in Pakistan, she's doing a wonderful job, every day communicating with mothers, with women to addressing issues of radicalization. Also, the issue of we cannot leave community isolated. I was in the Central African Republic in April, and there is a place called in Bangui in Central African Republic called Kilometer 5. And that is where the central mosque of Central African Republic is. And everybody saying that, there is an element of Boko Haram there, you shouldn't go there and all of that. But I told him, I want to talk to the Imam on the phone and I want to invite him. And so I talked to the Imam and I told him that, we want to meet. And we had a meeting actually with our ambassador, U.S. ambassador in Bangui. And the Imam was not invited, but I told our senior advisor that we need to talk to him. So I talked to him on the phone. And so he didn't come, but I told him, why don't send a delegation? I want to talk to your people. So he sent 2 women and 1 man to meet with me. So we had a discussion, and then I told him, okay, I'm going to delay my my travel and come to the mosque tomorrow. And I went to the mosque and talked to them. I find out that these people are completely isolated. There is no communications between them and any mainstream or the Muslim communities around the world, and they are open to that kind of discussion. So we need to find these kind of people and have that level of engagement and communications going.
Okay. Any comment, or we'll open the floor to your questions. Yes, please, Kara, in the back, please. And identify.
Good morning. Thank you very much for your comments. I'm Carol Murphy. I'm a journalist. I would like to get your thoughts on an issue which is very prevalent when we talk about radicalism. For years, Saudi Arabia spent a lot of money building church mosques and paying for imams around the world with their version of Islam, which is very fundamentalist. After 9/11 and after Al-Qaeda had violent insurgency in Saudi Arabia, the government changed its mind about all this money. Some people say that Saudi Arabia is no longer supporting this kind of promotion of Wahhabism around the world. Others say no, that's not true. The government still is supporting it. I'd like to hear your thoughts from the 3 of you on what's the current status of this effort.
Okay.
You'd like me to go first? Sure.
I'm thinking.
Oh, no, I'll go first. I mean, the premise of your question is slightly off because you say that the government is not supporting the Wahhab. The government is the Wahhabs. They're together. It's part of the government. So the religious establishment in Saudi Arabia, the Wahhab family, is what gives the royal family in Saudi Arabia religious legitimacy. So they are part and parcel of the same thing. The policies of supporting the Wahhabi views have not abated one iota. This is government, Saudi government propaganda made solely for Western consumption and larger here in the United States. The government of Saudi Arabia, as I said, gains its legitimacy from an intimate alliance with the religious establishment in Saudi Arabia, which has a very particular point of view. Now, to the Saudi government's credits, they have made, because as you pointed out in your question, there was a violent uprising by Al-Qaeda inside Saudi Arabia, and the Saudi government put that down pretty extensively, although the remnants of it are still active in Yemen. And they have made some efforts at trying to redirect young men away from a violent path and trying to institute some reforms in the thinking, but it has not gone very deep. It's not very profound, and the support for mosques and Islamic centers throughout the world that export this way of thinking has continued and has not abated in one bit. I don't know whether that's your experience.
I just to give you, I mean, I think there's a different angle to this as well, because I was looking at our brief from Pakistan, because the issue of madrasas in Pakistan, first of all, ever since 9/11, it's been a growth industry, frankly. And some, it's not that they're all radical or not, but there are plenty that the messaging that's being sold or taught is very much of the type of Wahhabi version that we're seeing. And the problem is that this is a self-perpetuating issue. So, for example, they have madrasas for women. Now, in Pakistan, where you have a traditional culture, for some people, sending their daughters to madrasas is a way of giving them a sort of certification. It's almost like a seal of she's going to be a good wife type of a thing. So you have girls going into these schools. They're getting certain messaging, and then they get to open other madrasas, other girls' madrasas, and it becomes an income earner. So you don't even need to go back to the original source. It's self-perpetuating in terms of an income generation for women, if you want, except that the messaging is incredibly intolerant. So this is the kind of thing that even if we ever believed that the money from the Gulf, the individuals and so forth, was no longer flowing, which it continues to flow, that's why I'm saying it's seeded something that is now growing within these societies and destroying what they had in the past. In Pakistan was, Hindus, Sikhs, Shias, Islam, Jews, they all lived there together. And it's in the last 30 years, and especially in the last 10 years, that we suddenly see this incredible intolerance just becoming normalized. And that's very, very scary to see. Once it becomes normalized, it's not just, it becomes mainstream. That's why we call it extremism in the mainstream. Mm-hmm. That's very hard to push back. And it needs these other tactics to tackle it. And education, I think, is a really big part of this. Yeah.
Muhammad?
I just want to really, so can Saudi Arabia now fighting Al-Qaeda inside Saudi Arabia, because it's presenting a threat for their establishment or for their basically political influence as well, right? And also trying to stop the financing that goes to the radical groups around the world and all of that. So that efforts, how do you see it with the current status?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think the government of Saudi Arabia has gone after Al-Qaeda inside Saudi Arabia, and also has tried to stop the financing directly of Al-Qaeda around the world and the more violent groups. The problem, though, is much deeper than that, because, as I pointed out to the questioner, if the ideology is part of your legitimacy for ruling, the royal family gains its legitimacy and popularity among the people, I think, primarily from its association with the Wahhab family, which is the founder of this belief system is Muhammad Wahhab, and his family is still part of, they're descendants of them. In many ways, that's the true royal family in Saudi Arabia. So while the royal family, the Saud family, actually runs the military and the government, this family runs the religious establishment, without which the Al-Sauds feel very vulnerable. They have a lot of wealth and a lot of control that's not generally shared. I mean, they give a lot in Saudi Arabia, but the inequalities in that society are quite stark. So their legitimacy to govern comes from their association with the religious family. So they let them call the shots on these things, on matters of religion and belief. So while they're going after the more violent manifestations, I think somebody said, I think it was Hala, said that there's two kinds. There's the extremism and then the violent extremism. Yeah. So the Saudis have gone after the violent form of it, but not the extreme form of it, which is where the violence comes from. So you're only really, you're putting a Band-Aid on a wound, not cutting out the cancer.
Karen Murphy, who asked the question, was a fellow at the Wilson Center. I believe it was 2 years ago. She did an excellent book on the younger generation in Saudi Arabia, and the Wilson Center published it. So we would like you, I mean, if you get a chance, just go and take a look at the book. Yes, please, just wait for the mic, please, and identify yourself.
Thank you very much. Michael Kurtzig, formerly of the Department of Agriculture. In my work in the Middle East and Africa, in economic development, agricultural development, I came to the conclusion that one of the most radical things that underlie all this is poverty. That these people have no jobs, they have no vested interest in the economy. They see their lives sort of wasted, and so they become easily subjected to these radical thoughts. There are millions of people in Egypt and other places that have no jobs, have no hope for jobs. Do your organizations deal with any of this to alleviate some poverty? And for instance, does a madras school teach anything practical, anything marketable in today's economy? So I wait your answer. Thank you very much.
Who is going to tackle that? Mohammed?
Yeah, so I mean, I completely agree. I mean, we have to address condition conducive to violent extremism. So we need to address this. I mean, I'm referring again to the study that we just did for Shabab. We found out they are, let me see the statistic, 27% actually for people who join a Shabab, the reason for joining a Shabab was an economic reason. 27%. Because, and we see this also, in fact, in the different radical groups who are now fighting in Syria. Because they actually leave Al-Assad regime or army to join ISIS or any other group, or or Nusra or Daesh and all of that, because they guarantee their salaries and all of that. So if we want really to address this issue, we also need to look into conditions that make these things happen. I mean, and particularly poverty and economic development and all of that is very critical, actually. So what we are trying to do is that we increase the capacity of civil society groups who are working on the ground and finding a way to link them with foundation that can help them to do development work. For instance, we are working in a Zaatari camp in Jordan with the youth, vocational training and all of that, and skills, so that they're not directed to any kind of radical kind of ideology, but actually they have a profession that they can pursue.
So I think the issue is not poverty as in and of itself. It's relative deprivation, right? So it's seeing you're poor here and now your politician is driving a Mercedes, and then you're watching television and you're seeing this whole world. I mean, we can't deny the whole kind of what people are being exposed to, either in their own communities, in their own countries, but also out and beyond. So there's, I think, that part of it. The other issues, and I sort of link this, it's not, I don't think it's just an Islamic thing. I did a 10-country study in 2009 for UNDP on looking at young men getting involved in violence in Kenya and in Jamaica and in Liberia. And it's not just about getting a job, it's about dignity. Right, so and I remember talking, so on the one hand, it's about manhood, which is really interesting. So on the one hand, you say to them, well, what does it mean to be a man? And it's about being able to provide for your family, right? So providing is an important. And what gives you prestige? Well, it used to be, if you're a doctor or a social, an engineer or something, that gave you prestige. When you have crisis, that's gone. That type of, the prestige might come through having a gun or being able to exert force in some sort of way. But if you said to them, well, you want to provide for your families, why don't you go sell in the market? The guy says, that's a woman's job. So there's this paradox of, on the one hand, they want to provide, on the other hand, it has to be something that they think gives them dignity, and what do we mean? Where does dignity come in? So I think that's one of the issues. And what I found, and this comes back to sort of why we want to bring this into the international development discussions, is that so much of the, 30 years we have forced privatization of healthcare, privatization of education, all, structural adjustments. So when you go to poor countries, education and healthcare basic services are not free, right? These guys provide those services. The gang leaders in Jamaica provide books for the kids to go to school, right? The Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas, and they provide healthcare, right? So we have ceded, I mean, when we think about human rights as a broad agenda, we've put so much emphasis on political, political rights up here. And we've left this whole social and economic rights to food, right to shelter, right to education. We left this vast vacuum, and guess who's filled it? Somebody goes in and fills that vacuum. And it's these guys. And you can, as I said, you can see it in our context as these Islamic groups, but take it to South America, take it to Africa. It's all sorts of other groups who then tapping into these communities, and people are. So we need to really revisit a whole sort of spectrum of the way that we're engaging.
One quick footnote. I concur with both Sanam and Mohammed in their comments, but it's important to remember that not everybody who joins the radical cause comes from poverty. Osama bin Laden came from great wealth. That fellow I was talking to you about in the story, in the dream, he came from one of the large feudal-owning families in Pakistan. Many people go to a path from radicalism coming from great wealth and relative wealth. So there's not a direct line between poverty and radicalism.
The back. I think I took enough questions from the front. The back, please. Yes, the lady there. Sure.
Thank you. My name is Sabira Qureshi. Yes, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes,
Sabira
Sabira.
Qureshi.
Louder, please.
Thank you to all the panelists for their views. One of the things I've been struggling with as I sort of sat here listening to all the discussions is how you're actually dividing the line between extremism, radicalization, terrorism. We use all of these words, but we really need to understand at what point does this one turn into the other, and how are we kind of defining the different isms here? Because one of the things that I if you could talk to a little bit, is what the societies within these countries, within the Muslim majority countries, how they are seeing this whole thing. Because what one has seen, especially...
That's the question, no comments, please.
Yeah.
We have very
so
little
if you could
time
just
and too
talk
many-
about the polarization in these societies and how they have led to a sort of tacit, not absolute condemnation of the terrorism, and how that has led to a further rise in the legitimacy of these.
Thank you. Sana, you want to take that?
Okay. So first of all, the extremism. I mean, the reason why we are interested in this notion of extremism in the mainstream before it becomes violent is because it seeds these issues of what you tolerate, right? So if you have messaging over and over again that, women are second class, or that how we treat women, violence against women is a cultural issue, it's a family issue, it's etc. You're basically sending a message that this is okay, right? So you're spreading that notion of condoning. Now, it can be about women, it can be about minorities, it can be about Christians in Pakistan. It's that space that any form of violence that takes place, we excuse it in some sort of way. And by we, I mean both at the national level, right? Where, a so-called honor killing, if you want, is somehow framed as that's a domestic issue. But also internationally, when we hear it, we say that's not the kind of violence we're interested in, right? But those are indicators of how you have that kind of environment, and then it doesn't take very many people to become radicalized for us to have violence. In most of the places that we look at, 90 to 95% of the people who could be radicalized are not becoming radicalized, right? So it takes a very small percentage to create a huge amount of violence and destruction. But that environment, I think, is really important. And then the other side of this, of course, is that we need to be very honest about why people are sympathetic. So if you have a government that is, or a police force that is coercive and predatory and is actually a source of violence and corruption, or if you have, for example, in Iraq, the government blew up the water plant in Mosul. So 1/3 of the population in Mosul right now doesn't get water in under 50 degrees centigrade heat. And they said it's because ISIL was there. Well, the population is being punished by their own government. The police forces, the state forces that are part of the problem. It's not good guys and bad guys. It's actually many formations of people who are doing bad stuff to the local population. And each of them in their own ways then creates an environment for this. Terrorism, I hate that term. I remember 20 years ago when I started this work, in England, somebody tried to define it and they came up with 103 definitions of the word of what terrorism means, whether it's a barrel bomb on your head, a drone on your head, if you're being killed by violence, the source and who's doing it and whether they're justified has a very different meaning for everybody. So who's the terrorist is a whole different concept, I think, for me.
No, okay. Next question. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Benjamin Tua. My question concerns the comments that the extremists that Ken Ballin interviewed made about Jews and the context in which they made these comments. You can pick all kinds of things, positive and negative, out of the Quran and other religious texts. And my question is, to what extent is the Israeli occupation and the periodic violence between the two sides driving these types of views and selective comments about Jews, especially in a context where the Israeli actions seem vastly disproportionate to the casualties suffered by Israelis? Thank you.
Well, I'll answer that very directly. These men were Taliban men. They were operating in the environment of Pakistan and Afghanistan. Their concerns were Pakistan and Afghanistan. They were not focused on the Arab-Israeli conflict. So these views came from the madrasas and the teachings that they received inside Pakistan and Afghanistan, and nothing to do with the politics of the Middle East. That's the reality.
But I think maybe I can add just one sentence. It's important to mention that, most of these views or these kind of extremists, they are not necessarily well educated about the Quran and the tradition itself. One of the documents that was actually gotten from Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, the raids, is actually one of their training manuals clearly say that, you should not be exposed to knowledgeable people in Islam. So they keep them. This is you can go and read it. I mean, they keep them, not ignorant about all kind of, of teaching of Islam.
Gentleman in the back, yes. We move around the room, so.
Thank you very much. I'm Lado. I'm Lado. I work in Ivory Coast, but I've been here at Wilson Center for the last 3 months researching on a similar topic, but in sub-Saharan Africa, the growth of, religious violence.
Your question, please.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
So the question is, I don't know what are your thoughts on, how easy it is for these groups to get access to arms. I mean, the issue of arm trafficking. I don't know whether you think the international community has been dealing with it directly and, what are your thoughts about this?
Thank you.
Well, it's very easy to get access to arms. I mean, their arms are all over the place, and these groups, people profit from it, and the leaders profit from it, and it's a big black market, and everyone is armed to the teeth.
Yeah, if you think about the weapons that went from Libya across the region, or if you think about the weapons that were imported into Iraq or never fully collected, the weapons that existed. This is just recycled all over the place. So the weapons piece of it, unfortunately, really has not been dealt with at all, and it's certainly a big issue.
Lady in the front, just wait for the mic, please. Here, the first row, please. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Dina Shiroki. So it seems like a lot of the conversation today is focused on long-term strategies to combating extremism. And it seems like our government is a bit more concerned with the rise and influence of extremist groups and short-term security consequences. So I was wondering, how do we balance these short-term concerns that often lead us to reverting to guns and drones, which probably only perpetuate recruiting terrorism, but also focus on a long-term strategy, and just balancing those two? Thank you.
Who wants to take that?
Well, it is a problem, and I think you've identified it, and I think, the United States has had a lot of success since 9/11, eliminating the leadership of so-called Al-Qaeda Central with bin Laden, and I think right now it has very little force and very little influence. But the larger problem is growing. I mean, the Taliban are growing, and radicalism and extremism in Pakistan and Afghanistan is growing, and we see what's happening in the Middle East and Africa. So, we've dealt with a lot of the short-term security. We've won the battle, but if it's a war, we're certainly losing it.
Thank you.
I would, I think, we, Musarat Qadim and other partners that we have in the region, they consistently say to us, we need resources for rehabilitation. Right now in Syria, we need resources for education. Right. If we lose a generation of Syrians, it's where we've lost, 30 years. So the issue of where do we put resources in terms of shoring up the existing capacities and making sure that we're not losing what we already have is really important. And yet, when you look at, again, the resources that go, percentage of resources that go, how often we talk to these people, whether they're engaged, whether we listen to them. They'll come and talk, but do we actually listen and take what they're telling us is needed for the short term, but also the long term? It's not happening.
Yeah, I think, our government here also, there are a lot of programs actually addressing the short term. For instance, when, any elements of extremism or any violent or something happen, I understand that the State Department, sometimes organize a video conferencing between religious leaders from the United States and religious leaders in that particular country. For instance, after Boko Haram abducted the girls in Nigeria, we joined a video conference from the United States through our embassy in Abuja, and they talked to religious leaders there, and as a result, we brought the religious leaders to Abu Dhabi to discuss similar issues. So there are some kind of initiatives like that.
Follow up to your question to the panel by me. In the region, we have a number of very wealthy countries in the Gulf states, for example. Shouldn't they be more involved in precisely funding civil society, funding education, all these things? I mean, as someone who comes from the region, I think there comes a time where we should stop constantly looking at the West for aid and make use, or at least pass these responsibilities to the countries in our region who are capable of helping, and their help is much more accepted than ours. Comment?
Absolutely, yes, emphatically. Yeah. And that's part of the problem. You have Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries not doing these efforts, and in a negative way, actually funding things that are harmful, but certainly not taking the lead on this. And I think you're absolutely right, Hala. I think the United States should pressure these nations to change their behavior. And you know what? They have to listen to us because we provide their security. So we have more influence with them. They're not calling the shots, but yet we do nothing in that regard.
Well, I was going to say that look what they're already putting money into education, and look what it's getting us, unfortunately. But going back to what Ken was pointing, I was in Europe last year having conversations about these issues and saying, why are we seeing Qataris funding Al-Shabaab, or why are we hearing that these various countries mentioned? And in the foreign ministry of one of the countries, they said to us, we've been talking to various people from the Gulf, and somebody said to us, we prefer to be in the kitchen making the meal than to be the food on the table to be eaten. And I said, but this is a really short-term attitude, because these things, once they grow, it comes and eats all of us up. And I think that's really the message that needs to be, that what we're seeing in Iraq and Syria is the culmination of things that have been going on for a long time, and it's not getting better. Things are getting worse, and at some point we have to stop this kind of disaster and say, okay, how are we going to go take a much longer term vision of where we want to go, and who's going to be on board working in a collective, and you know, the education piece becomes profoundly important. Corruption, good governance, all these things become important. And yet at the UN level right now, just to finish off, the term culture of peace is being debated about whether it should be used or not by a vast majority of countries, because they say culture of peace then means that we have to talk about governance, good governance, then that means that you're going to come and intervene. So this is the sort of discourse that we've now created, unfortunately.
Yes. William, here, the second row, please. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. My name is Milad Abraham with the National Council on U.S. and Arab Relations. We discussed today traditional change, and that we need traditional leaders and traditional religious leaders and traditional leaders, and also women. Are there plans in any of these programs that you have been working on for Christian and Jewish leaders in the region that are highly respected among society? Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I was going to talk about the importance of the interfaith engagement. It's very critical, and it's important to have that kind of collaboration. And in fact, the meeting we had with the Nigerians in Abu Dhabi, originally we were going to have an interfaith meetings. So we contacted the Cardinal John Okayan of Nigeria to bring 15 to 20 Christian leaders, and we will and the Muslim leaders in one meeting. But when we talked to the Muslim leadership, we found out that the Muslims are not yet ready to engage of interreligious discussion. So that's why we started with the Muslim leadership, and then the next meeting we will bring the Christian leadership as well. So it's very critical to have that engagement. And the workshop that we're going to have in September in Washington, in fact, we're not only focusing on Muslim scholars or Muslim leaders who are addressing these issues on the ground, but we are bringing Christian also. We're bringing monks from the Buddhism and others to discuss these kind of issues. Also, our network. When we went to Central African Republic, we took an interfaith delegation. We had Cardinal McCarrick with us, as well as Pastor Leith Anderson, the head of the National Associations of Evangelical, so that we can show that example of peaceful coexistence and how we can address these issues of violence as, together.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Ann Sweetser, and the last speaker, last questioner raised in my mind the question about the diasporas. Is there anything being done to support efforts by Pakistanis and Arabs and so on in the West for themselves? And they can come out and give a lot of money when there's need for when there's a disaster. But are they being urged to invest in education and other positive issues, positive investments? Thank you.
Anybody talking about the bias?
I think actually there are two dimensions to this. One is that recently I was talking to somebody about how the extremists are using social media to radicalize their own communities in the West, right? So we're hearing that these young men who go over, so that they're tapping into that for their own purposes. We also from the Pakistan work that we've done, we also know that there are Pakistani diaspora who, for very positive reasons, think that supporting a madrasa is a good thing. It's it's good for their faith, right? So it's not that they're doing it as a to want to radicalize. They just think that they're being good Muslims. So the question is then who's controlling what's being taught? And there's a huge variance in terms of the various communities, the messaging that's being taught. But in terms of a collective kind of outreach and saying, okay, how do we, I honestly, I don't know to what extent that's being done and how it would be received or who would have to lead that sort of a thing so that it's not perceived as being manipulated by the West or being a tool of the US, etc. People, it's very scary if you feel that you're being, targeted in some sort of way between the two sides, if you want.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the issue of diaspora is very critical. I know of Secretary Clinton actually started a program called, I think, Engaging Civil Societies. And she invited the diasporas communities, realizing their role. And I remember her remarks at that time, that was a few years ago, or 2 years or 3 years ago. She said that, it's no longer is brain drain, it's the brain gain. So we want the diaspora actually to give back to their countries. I am also aware of the USIP, United States Institute of Peace. They just engaged Syrian religious leaders in a meeting in Istanbul, and the next round actually they're going to bring Syrian religious leaders to engage them with the Syrian diaspora here in the United States. So these efforts, we need to increase that efforts, because really diaspora can contribute a lot to issues of education and other issues as well.
Yes, please. Just wait for the mic.
Thank you. My name is Matej Jungver, and my question is more on the end of women's rights and the role of women in modern Arab societies mostly. I lived in Amman for 4 months, and from the conversations and impressions I got the impression that when Arab women in these societies speak out of women's rights, of women's inclusion, of women's role in conflict, in alleviating extremism, they are too often and too easily labeled by the male majority, as not speaking on behalf of themselves, but advocating on behalf of a foreign Western construct. So my question is, how can these women, or in what ways can they preserve the agency they have from the very beginning, but that's being denied to them by the male major society? Thank you.
That's definitely a problem, that they're being accused. I mean, in fact, all of us, the minute you say, you're working on women's rights, it's very often, oh, this is a Western agenda. And it's very frustrating because we hear it from Westerners as well. Okay, so the Westerners are also undermining. And I think the issue, again, is how, partly it's how we frame it. I don't think of human rights, and the women that we work with on the ground who are on the front lines fighting for these things, they don't think of it as Western values. They don't think of it as your values, it's universal values. And what I found in my conversation, I remember having a discussion with 2 former Taliban leaders, and actually with Somali leaders as well. You don't have to go in and say, what do you think about women's rights? But you can say, what kind of lives do you want for your daughters and for your wives and for your sisters, and it's for your community? And all of a sudden, it becomes a framework where universal human rights is very present. So we need to sort of think about the vocabulary and the terminology that we use, but also listening to the women themselves around what they want, how they want us to engage with them. In the Arab world, one of the things which is interesting is that they said foreign funding should stop, right? Like in Egypt, it's happened. What the foreign funding they meant was Western funding. It wasn't funding from the Gulf states. That funding was okay to come. So this is also part of the discourse that we should be challenging, that if you don't want foreign funding, why this and why not that? If you don't want Western funding, why is it okay to fund military assistance and not civil society, engage civil society? I mean, the universality and the connections that exist and has to be understood, and the fact that these women are fighting for universal rights in their own context is something that we have to respect. We shouldn't make it worse by saying, oh, they're the Westernized ones and so forth as well.
Yes, please. Just wait for the mic. Thank you.
Hello, Malia Gramada-Jones with the St. Albans School of Public Service. Earlier, it was said that religious leaders would have a larger impact because these are religious extremists, and in this day and age, social media is a good way to express and influence ideas. So my question is, what kind of impact do you think that arts and humanities programs would have in influencing and expressing ideas about freedom, rights and democracy to combat religious extremist ideas such as the Afghan Women's Writing Project?
Who wants to take that? Okay. Muhammad, it's up to you.
I mean, I can give you a general comments here. Religious leaders are important in addressing issues of religious freedom and democracy and all of that. And I can refer to an initiative that we have started 3 years ago to promote citizenship and religious freedom and rights of religious minorities in the Muslim majority communities. And we engage religious leaders, that's in the Muslim world in particular, and under the leadership again of Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, we had a meeting in Mauritania where we discussed issues of religious freedom and citizenship, full citizenship, and we raised questions about the religious minorities who are living in the Muslim majority communities. Do they have full citizenship? What are their rights? What kind of religious freedom that they enjoy? And then we responded to these questions by a number of scholars from the Muslim world in Tunisia. And the discussion in Tunisia was actually meant to influence the discussion at that time on Tunisia constitution. Which came beautifully, addressing the issues of religious freedom. And basically, we hope that these efforts will bring a declaration adopted by the Muslim world, clearly identify standards and protocol for full citizenship, just like our bills of rights here. So this effort is going on, and still we're working on the project.
Just from our side, we think that having the voices and the alternative voices in social media and mass media is actually really, really important. Because if you're sympathetic to the Syrian cause right now and you're here, what do you hear? You hear you hear the extremist voice, obviously, or you see that we know that there's the Syrian government is bombing. We hear that. We hear the discourse in the States about whether we should bomb or whether we should give them weapons, and it's all about weaponization. And yet on the ground, people are telling us, no, we don't want more weapons. Weapons have actually strengthened the regime. Weapons have, the opposition is it's another form of dictatorship. We need alternative sources. Those voices need to come out in the social media so that if you're somebody who's sympathetic to the Syrian cause, is given an alternative, right? It's not that you're not going to go and become it's actually here, support funding for education, support their humanitarian assistance, support their version of what they think their country needs. And it's been very hard to get those voices into the mainstream media. It's hard to get them even into social. We're beginning to work on these issues, but they're so busy on the ground doing relief and recovery and constantly kind of actually active, addressing the crisis, that to now say to them, okay, now we also need you to be doing fancy videos and multimedia and this and that. It's kind of this incredible burden, but it's something that our partners on the ground are beginning to be interested in, and we're hoping that we can generate the funding to be able to give them the training and so forth to be able to support them. So I think the writing projects and things are going to be very, very important. Thank you.
The lady in the middle, yes. And then we move to the back.
Thank you all. And I'm Bakistan. I'm also a student with the St. Albans School of Public Service. And my question is, what and why do you think that the international community and mainstream media have yet to really even acknowledge the women's organizations you were talking about in these countries, let alone assist them?
Well, it's not that they're all not recognizing, or there is some recognition and there's some assistance. I think that there's a tendency to overlook local capacities. I really think that it's almost as if people have been trained to think in terms of international relations and big power issues, and we give our assistance through the UN and through that. And you don't actually look at it from an anthropological perspective of what's actually going on the ground. Who are the frontline responders? Who are the first responders, if you want? And then we have questions of the protocol. Oh well, our partners on the ground say we need cash assistance. We need to give people cash. They don't need just bundles. They have the capacity. And then you bring it to humanitarian organizations. And to give cash, that's a different, how do we, the processes aren't there and the protocol isn't there. So there's all sorts of bureaucratic problems, but then there's a perception problem as well, which is, I think, the point that you're saying, that it's, if you're a civil society, the minute you say I'm a civil society organization, people are like, well, do you represent this? And who how do you legitimate yourself? And the reality actually is that if they had weapons, we would talk to them. You know, when you have weapons, at some point you're bad enough, we invite you to a table and we give you. But if you're civil society in Afghanistan or Pakistan or Syria and you're fighting non-violently for what you want, the paradigm that we have is, well, who are you? What are you? You know, are you elite? Are you grassroots? Are you fully represent? And so we're trying to shift that discourse and say, well, look at what values they represent. You know, what do they uphold? And what are they doing on the ground? If they're doing relief and recovery work, they should be sitting in the humanitarian discussions that the governments have around assistance to Syria or wherever it happens to. If we're doing political mediation, you should have the groups that are supportive of a political process with you in the process. It's a massive sort of paradigm shift, if you want. And they've made more progress, I think, with religious leaders than they have with women. With women, there's a double discrepancy and discrimination that goes on. You know, oh, these women, you know, which women? And it's constantly, it's a very tiring kind of argument to make. But it's like, at the end of the day, they're 50% of the population. And even if 0.1% have stood up and they're doing work on the ground, how dare we challenge who they are? They're putting their lives at risk for their own country. So we have to shift our own mentality, I think, on this side of the aisle.
Yes, the lady in the back. White dress, yes. No, okay. We take two questions together.
Hi, panelists. Thank you so much for your time. I'm from the U.S. Department of State in the Office of International Religious Freedom. Mohammed, my question most likely would be geared towards you. I'd just like to follow up on a question. You were speaking a little bit about the rights of minority groups within these Muslim communities. My question for you is, what are the mechanisms that you've been using to empower these religious leaders that oftentimes are a little too nervous to speak out about the plights of their communities that are seriously being put under pressure? So what are the powerful mechanisms that you've seen work to empower these leaders to speak out?
The lady in the white too. Let's take two questions. Yes.
That kind of works out well, because my question was going to be, can you give some more specific examples of what sort of work religious leaders or women can do to help the situation?
Yeah.
So.
Mohammed, you take both questions, please.
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much. So first of all, when we started this particular project, we invited Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayet to the United States. That was 3 years ago, to discuss the issue. And our discussion with him and with the Muslim world in general is that we as a Muslim communities living in the United States, we enjoy a good interreligious relationship with the society at large. And when issues of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiments in our country here, the religious leaders from all denominations, Christian and Jews and others, they came and stand with Muslim communities and created an organization that to respond. And we told the Muslim world that, you know, now we also very concerned about what is going on for religious minorities who are living in the Muslim majority communities, and we need to work on this project. So when we invited Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayet here, the first thing I have done, actually, I took him to the State Department, to your department, to your bureau, actually. And he got briefing from the 12 different teams, and the ambassador at large for international religious freedom, Susan Johnson Cook. So he got briefing to understand the magnitude of the problem. Then he convened this meeting for scholars in Mauritania to raise these questions. So the mechanism that we are using, trying to equip the scholars in the Muslim world about this problem, educating them, and also finding solution to them. Not getting information from governments, but actually getting information from religious minorities who are on the ground. using what? Using our relationship with the National Council of Churches here, or the Conference of Catholic Bishops, or the Coptic community, or other communities, Christian communities, Pakistani Christian communities in the United States, because they know the problems there. So we're getting information from them, not from their government. So that's the mechanism we use. And then our hope to come up with this declaration, the declaration to address these issues and to be adopted, by international institutions. There are so many challenges. I mean, I can talk to you about it. Some countries, they're not happy with these efforts, of course. They said that maybe if you are bringing this declaration to international institutions, one day we may find ourselves before the court of law. So there are a lot of issues I can talk about that. The second question was about, I forgot the second question. Yeah, I'm sorry.
This can be for anybody. Are there more specific examples you guys could give about what sort of work can be done, whether it's religious leaders or women, or religious leaders and women, to solve or at least help some of these problems?
Right. So there are specific examples I can give you through the network, and particularly the Fin Church Aid engage the traditional leaders and religious leaders in Somalia, addressing these issues of radicalizations on the ground. And that work is really well recognized to minimize the impact of Shabab and others. Another example I can give you, the extremists and the radical, they use sometimes an old text and 100 years fatwa that given by Ibn Taymiyyah. This is now examined by Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya 3 years ago, and came up with something called Mardin Declaration. The conference took place, and he found a lot of mistakes and misconceptions in that particular 100 years old fatwa. And I'm happy to share with you the document. You can really. So we presented this kind of new findings to those who are actually joining the extremist group. We've got a lot of heats from Al-Qaeda and all of that, but I think these are practical examples.
On the question of women specifically, in our brief we have some outlines, but for example, you have the groups like Masawa that are challenging the monopoly of religious leaders over interpretations of text. You've got groups on the ground, a lot of groups on the ground, who are putting rights-based approaches into the religious discourse in their various communities. The whole idea of the groups that are still fighting for gender equality laws, or trying to take away discriminatory laws that exist, or fighting for constitutions that are not just based on Sharia, that they have a broader framing of human rights and so forth, and then the groups that are on the ground doing de-radicalization of youth, which is a more sort of it's a smaller subset, but you have organizations like that. You've got organizations doing peace education work. All of these things all contribute, and if you want more information, we can certainly provide it. Thanks.
I'm going to take the last two questions and then give the panelists final remarks, 1 minute each. Lady here and the lady here. Okay.
Right. Hi, thank you. My name is Catherine Zuck. I'm from the World Faiths Development Dialogue. And so I was just curious, are there any efforts on behalf of the non-extremist religious leaders to provide the same type of welfare provisions that the extremist leaders are using to recruit people?
Okay, and here, William. Here, yeah. Brief question, please.
Hi, my name is Ariel Panich. I'm a student at UPenn. I was wondering, to what extent do you think that Islamophobia has impacted extremism in the Middle East?
Okay, thank you. Okay, who takes what?
I think. So I can begin Islamophobia and also the examples of religious leaders, and how the best example I will give you is that, and I hope really the Muslim world look into this. Morocco is doing a wonderful job in empowering actually their religious leaders and addressing these issues of welfare. Morocco also is doing something that is different, and that is through an initiative called to empower women. They call them Rashidat. Basically, Rashidat mean people can give guidance, to train these women to be religious leaders, actually teaching people in the mosque and all of that is a beautiful example, and I hope the Muslim world really to take that seriously. I have a friend who is leading an institution in Morocco aimed to actually empower religious leaders, imams and religious leaders, and to look into those social issues and all of that. It's a whole institution called, I think, King Mohammed Sadis Institution for Social Justice or something in Rabat. So this is a specific example. Islamophobia, what actually we see is a direct link between what's going on in the Muslim world and what's going on here in Islamophobia, because people see what's happening on the TV for religious minorities and the Christian minorities in the Muslim world, and the reaction here is really Islamophobia or the rising anti-Muslim sentiment. So there is a link between the two.
Thank you. Last comments. Let's start, Ken. You don't want? Yeah.
I would just conclude by saying that we have a fundamental lack of understanding of the radicals and what gives rise to the radicals here in the United States. So I think that as we're pursuing policy prescriptions, rather than thinking of the policy first and then going and reacting, we need to start understanding how people become radicalized, what does that mean, and the only way you can do it is by actually talking to them and having a dialogue. And you know, and I would conclude by saying this. I mean, in terms of, we're sitting in the Capitol of the United States, so it's important to talk about American policy. There are some severe limits to American policy and how much we can influence this. And you know, I would just say, go back to the old Hippocratic rule, which we haven't followed, is first do no harm. And I'm afraid some of our policies do more harm than good. And I think this would correspond to the sentiment of most Americans. I mean, we need to have some pullback from parts of the world. I mean, we can't go in there trying to remake everyone in our image. We can support efforts, but we've got to be careful. And the more we support, sometimes the deeper the reaction to our presence, and which can only foment radicalism. It's not just dropping the bombs. I mean, it's trying to put our vision on the world on people too. So we have to recognize the limits of what the United States can do, and we have to understand people and have a dialogue before we come to the policy prescriptions.
I want to concur with everything that Ken has said, and actually say we need to understand what people there are also aspiring to, right? So, and the question of the social, economic, justice, dignity, corruption. I mean, these are all things that we all want for our lives. I ask people that. I've asked, you know, whenever I go, I say, what do you want for your lives? And frankly, you know, from gangland members in Jamaica to Talib leaders, there isn't that much difference in terms of what they want for their children and what I want for my children. And yet we somehow don't address those fundamental issues. And as you know, and we come up with these policies which is really just about ourselves. So we'll talk to them about piracy or terrorism, but we won't talk to them about drug addiction of their own boys in their own communities in Somalia or elsewhere. So that notion of what do they want, what are they aspiring to, and where is the common ground, and thinking about how we enable and support the local capacities and the existing resilience, I think is really part of it. So this is a radical change in the way we do business. The international community does business. We often go in and tell them what they need, as opposed to actually listening to what people are saying and engaging on a systematic basis. So I think that would certainly be the sort of the final message from my side.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, my final message would be is that that there is a need for the increased collaboration between governments and religious leaders and traditional leaders and civil society as a whole, those who are working on the ground. And also it's important that, yes, we have a limitation here as a country, but still we are able to influence policies and to encourage, people in the Middle East, in the Muslim world, to help education and other things. And finally, I want to just thank my co-panelists here, and particularly Ken today gave me a lot of tips, so I know where I'm gonna break my fast with all these descriptions, of the Lebanese food and all of that. Thank you so much.
I think. Can I have your attention, please? On your way out, make sure you take one of these cards, and not only you'll find out where the best Lebanese restaurants are, but where the radicals like to eat there. Thank you very much.